Hello, and welcome to the Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I am John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I am John Ash.
This week we're decided to talk about logging and metrics. John, why don't you go ahead and tell us, give us an overview of what that means?
Sure. So I've recently been giving a talk at local user groups and regional conferences about logging and metrics in .NET Core. Primarily, the talk kind of came out of what we were working on at one of my clients, adding in logging and metrics to a application that's been in existence for a little over a year now, and we were deciding that we needed to have a little bit more coverage, a little bit more understanding of how the application was behaving, and logging all of the events that the application was handling, and give us a little bit better place to go from when we were deciding what kind of focus that we need to deliver to certain parts of the application, determining what parts of the application may be performing well or underperforming, or where we really needed to address certain performance issues, as well as give us a little bit better background in case a bug comes up and we need to do a little bit of investigation to see how some unexpected behaviors happen.
So I guess one of the first questions that comes to my mind is, are we talking about logging with stuff that's built into Core, or is this third-party tools, or what are we using to actually capture the logging and the metrics?
Well, with .NET Core, there's a new interface that you can utilize, the iLogger interface, and there's really an opportunity to dive in and utilize what's already kind of built in. What's interesting too is there are a lot of third-party logging frameworks out there that can hook into those interfaces that already exist in the core system. So what we actually decided to go with was Serilog, which seems to be a rather popular logging application, logging framework that ties in pretty well to .NET applications these days. And before we go too much more in depth, I wanted to see what you guys are dealing with on your side. Do you do much logging or metrics or data capturing of health metrics of your applications?
All right. Well, I have been doing mostly front-end development for the past few years, and I guess I should be shamed, but we kind of just log whatever we feel like logging. It mostly goes to the console, although we do have a logging API that was created so that the logs that we're sending to the console also get sent up to the server with the appropriate log level. But we don't do any strict logging. Like, we don't have method entry and exit, and we don't have any kind of standard logging practice. Not even always on a try-catch, which maybe we should change that. But
what about you, Ash?
Yeah, recently I've been doing a lot of DevOps work, which has logging in its own element. But the last sort of development that I've done, we didn't do a ton, I'll be honest. We sort of got whatever we could get out of an out-of-the-box like Elma solution, where we were just capturing most of the event thrown exceptions and that sort of thing, and just locked those to the table, which worked for the most part for what we were doing. It was a pretty underutilized application. In fact, there could have been plenty of arguments as to why we were even writing it in the first place. But the people that were spending the money said, do it. So we did it. So this is an area that I tend to find that I feel like it's a weak spot for me. And it's one that I definitely have been trying to improve. Now, with the more recent sort of DevOps exposure, we have it in our timeline to do some more investigation on what kind of logging that we can add into our toolkit. Unfortunately, we've had bigger fish to fry, per se, and we've been trying to tackle those things first. And so I don't really can't say I have a ton of great options as far as like success stories on the logging we've implemented. But what I will say is, in addition to application logging, one of the areas that we are having to tackle as well is infrastructure and the like services or like health of applications and those sort of things, which is a whole nother can of worms. I feel like that often gets overlooked, especially from the developers who aren't necessarily the ones running the ops on these sort of things, and making sure that those. But as things become more containerized, as things become more sort of with platforms of services where you can almost self-host or utilize a system where people can the operations comes closer to the developer. I think it's probably something that we should keep in mind and be able to tie in the actual performance of and telemetry that are actually coming back from live production and sort of melding that back into our daily development.
To that end, I feel like most developers are probably like, logging, yuck. I don't really want to. It doesn't actually do anything. I can complete my work and I don't have to log, and it'll go out to production just fine, until it doesn't work, and then you're like, oh, I can't troubleshoot it because they won't give me debug access in prod. But is there like a minimal amount of logging that would be sufficient to get into the general practice of doing? And how much logging is too much logging?
Well, I would say you kind of alluded to it, that even in like a try catch, you're not being consistent in what you log. So I would say, at least in those scenarios, if you're catching an exception or you're expecting an exception, I would at a bare minimum probably log that. And Ash, you kind of alluded to it as well, that even myself, probably for the first half of my career, I was a maintenance developer. I would come in on existing projects and pick up wherever the application was left off and just add new features, maybe fix bugs, improve performance, whatever the case may be. So it was just a matter of picking up whatever pattern had been implemented before me. And if that included some logging, then I typically followed suit and added logging the same ways that logging existed before I arrived on the scene. So, kind of deciding that it's probably better to be proactive and log some of this stuff and determine what the requirements of the application are. Is this something that is going to exist for 6 months? Is it something that's going to exist for 2 years? Is it something that won't, will be in production for the next 5 years? If it's something little throwaway, then I'm still probably going to do a bare minimum of logging and metrics, just to make sure that the application's healthy. I used to have the mindset that if it compiled, ship it, early on in my career. I've since decided that wasn't maybe the most, probably wasn't the best way to handle those types of things. So, I'm really interested in performance these days. I want to know that the application can handle massive amounts of traffic, and to an extent. I don't want to go in gold plating something that really only needs to handle 10 concurrent users. One of the clients I'm working with now does have a performance concern on an API. So we needed to know that it would handle 10 million requests in a day, something like that. So, I'm building with performance in mind on some of these things.
Now, Clayton, you had mentioned like how much logging, and John, you had mentioned the logging interface built into .NET Core. Is there I know like there's a sense of being able to sort of ramp up those logging levels, and where you log everything if you have like obscene logging flag turned on, but then it doesn't actually change the flag for most running production. Does that interface have some of that stuff built in, or is that something you're going to have to rely on the frameworks you're using, or is that something we're going to have to handle?
Yeah, out of the box, you can specify what logging levels in system and things that you can decide is appropriate for your application. So maybe in development or in a QA or test environment, you can have a different logging level than you do in production. With that, we had decided on Serialog for the main project I'm working on, and that one has a variety of options, and you can log to console, you can log to a database, you can log to a number of different syncs is what Serialog utilizes. And you can really kind of tune that to your desired level. With that, I think Serialog also can interface with application insights, right? So if you're a .NET developer, if you're using Visual Studio, you're probably, if you're creating new applications, you're probably being bombarded by the modal with the checkbox to, do you want to add application insights? And for the longest time, I just ignored that and said, no, absolutely not. But I really started diving into application insights and really became interested in the types of things that it will capture for you, and realize that is essential when you're tracking down bottlenecks and performance concerns, and trying to glean some kind of information out of a cloud native application.
Now, you mentioned application insights, and I have very little experience with that as for when it comes to using it in Azure. But locally, when I'm debugging, I see it's just spewing out information. This method was called, this method exited, this SQL statement was used, just all kinds of stuff. How much of that can you actually get in Azure?
Well, depending on how if you're logging that type of stuff, then you can absolutely get that information in Azure as well. If you're feeding the Serialog sync into application insights, and you can get a lot of that telemetry information as well. But I also utilize a number of different other projects and resources, libraries, and things. One is appmetrics.io, app-metrics.io. And we were trying to get the main developer for that on the podcast, so hopefully we can sync up with him and get him on to talk about his project. But AppMetrics is another one that'll determine the health of your application, and there's a great little tutorial that he has to wire up to like a Grafana dashboard. And if you've seen some of my other speaking engagements that I do for user groups, I really enjoy Grafana dashboards. Dashboards are awesome. Grafana is awesome. I feel like if we can show a Grafana dashboard with useful information to decision makers in companies, then they're really going to get excited about the type of information that we can show to them and say, this is the health of the application. This is where your money's being spent. This is where your money's being lost. These are the types of things that we need to address to improve performance, maybe get more sales, better customer experience, those types of things. So, historically, when I was working as a maintenance developer and coming in and trying to track down bugs and defects, depending on the level of logging and detail that was being captured, it was often very difficult to find where a particular defect lived, right? What, in your guys' experience, what has been your experience of trying to track down defects in a production environment? Clayton, you had mentioned you're probably not going to get access to attach a debugger to a running application in production, right?
Yeah, no. Thankfully, I haven't had to troubleshoot too many production bugs in that fashion. I usually demand from whoever's reporting the bug a series of steps to reproduce it. In the few instances where we haven't gotten those steps and we haven't been able to reproduce it, we kind of stab at the dark and see if we can find something. Usually we don't find anything.
What about you, Ash?
Yeah, so I've run into a number of situations. I have always had some level of logging available whenever I've had to do production debugging, and so you get a little bit of the stack trace, maybe at least minimally kind of logging that an error has occurred. In instances where we haven't had like an error, an exception or something like that that's been thrown, and you get that. I just spent a lot of times just manually adding log statements and redeploying the application out there, and then hoping that the next wave of it will do it. And it is really troublesome. I mean, obviously, yeah, if you can get some steps and you can try to reproduce it locally, then that's probably you're more likely to figure it out. But it's in those instances that you can't reproduce locally and you're just simply trying to figure out what actually happened. Yeah, I remember one application we kept adding. I think we had like 3 or 4 rounds of redeploying this application, a fairly large, fairly high visibility application for a very large company, trying to put in more and more writing just outputs to databases to try and get visibility into what was happening in a particular function and why things were going wrong there. And eventually we may have been able to figure it out, but I think it still might have been a mystery to this day.
Yeah, and I've worked in a variety of different organizations where in order to make a change to add a debugging statement or add a logging statement and deploy that, it's a 2 or 3 week cycle to try to get that into a production environment. I've also worked in environments where they said, do whatever you need to do. Oh, by the way, we got a bug report from Joe Blow user. Feature doesn't work. Mm-hmm. That's in their eyes. They've given you enough information because they told you which feature and it's not currently working. Whether that means at all or in the way that they expected it to. Really, that's on your shoulders to go and find out what happened, and hopefully you've got some logging or something in there that can give you a little bit more information of where you might want to look. But oftentimes, you're going to have to go back to the user. You're going to have that conversation, and hopefully from there you can decide that we can be a little bit more proactive.
So this is probably not something that any of us have had too much experience in, but what about logging for more than just capturing errors? What about like looking at things like actual user utilization and maybe even, trying to understand, if you make a change, are you increasing some sort of activity in your application, or are you decreasing that? Have you guys looked or had any experience in logging these sorts of pieces of information?
Yeah, I've started gathering some information in metrics and trying to determine what features are being utilized, what methods are being called, what endpoints are being exercised, and that type of thing. Because really, as much information as you can get out of that, and then go back to the users, the client, the business, and say, this is where we spent money. This is where we're getting value out of that. We want to make sure that we're continuing to add value and not waste money. So we want to make sure that we're hitting those high points and being impactful and delivering value where we can. So if you can get that information to the right people, then they're going to love you for it. Especially if you can say, we were proactive. We saw that this user had an error. they probably didn't receive an error message, but we fixed it behind the scenes and we rolled out a patch or whatever the case may be. And that particular scenario won't happen again.
So recently, I've actually had this been asked to figure out how much something is being utilized, and it's not the prettiest method. But even if you use some IIS logs, there's some ways to use PowerShell, and actually you can actually do a pretty decent amount of sort of for free cleaning up those IIS logs. And get a lot of that information you're looking for. How frequently is an endpoint hit? What kind of unique users are you actually getting? Those sort of things. It's obviously a very basic thing, but it is sort of a great way to sort of say, hey, look what we can do, especially to a business who isn't fully vested in paying for adding more logging or that sort of thing. You can begin to sort of grab this information. There's some nice PowerShell out there that you can plug in. It'll consume the IIS logs so that you can manipulate them just like objects. And then you can then use that to sort of get that data and present it to them and say, hey, wouldn't you like to know more? Wouldn't you like to be able to find out a little bit more about what's actually going on with your application?
Yeah, and if you're adding logging into an application, or you're working on an application where logging is a new feature, or you're rethinking how you're implementing some of these things, you might want to take just a minute and plan on how to make this implementation. Do you really want to go and sprinkle logging messages throughout your application, throughout 18 different projects in a gigantic solution? Clayton, you and I worked on the project that you and I worked on first when we first were working together on a project. We were using AOP, an aspect-oriented programming package, to do the logging for us. Do you remember what that one was?
I probably would have if you hadn't asked me. I want to say it started with an S, but no, I can't remember. But yeah, I thought that method of logging was really neat. It allowed us to essentially not log and still get everything that we generally cared about logged. It just worked by putting an attribute onto the class, and then it would magically log entry and exit methods, entry and exit of every method.
Wow.
It was really, really neat. PostSharp. That was the name, PostSharp. It was kind of a pain to set up and to interact with, but the end result was really, really amazing. There are other AOP libraries. There's even some, at least one, that uses a Fluent interface and doesn't actually require the hooks that PostSharp required. Because PostSharp would actually rewrite the IL as part of a compilation step. So it was manually injecting code into your classes, which was really awesome, but it did mean it was doing a little bit of hacking on your code in the background.
And we know you're a fan of that.
Yeah, I love magic.
Yeah, and we had the creator of Mediator on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about CQRS and logging concerns and using something like Mediator to have a centralized place where all of the commands will come through, and that's a good place to implement something like logging, because you don't have to sprinkle logging messages throughout the rest of your code. You can just have a central place where you can do whatever logging messages that you need to do. There's also different places in things like a web API project where you can hook into like a middleware where you can add in logging in middleware, for instance. But if you're just getting started and looking to kind of progress on capturing more information, if you're just running Visual Studio and you hit F5 on an MVC or Web API project, and you're running through IIS Express, maybe a lot of that information is going to be kind of obfuscated away and hidden away from you. So you're probably not going to get a lot of information. So I would say probably the first thing is instead of running an IIS Express, drop down and run in Kestrel, run the actual API project itself, run it in Kestrel, keep the .NET command window open, and you can see all those logging messages that Clayton had mentioned earlier. And if you're using something like just the iLogging interface and logging directly to console or something like that, then you'll see all those logging messages pop up in that command window for you. You can also add the console sync for Serialog and log those messages there as well. So, it's a great place to get started.
One question I have is, do you generally find that you log to a database, or do you end up sort of configuring it to log to a file?
I typically log to a database just because I've been a database guy most of my career, so I know that that's where I'm safe, where I feel safe and comfortable logging that information. You might want to have a fallback in case the database is down or not available to the application. You don't want to lose all that information, so that might be a way to troubleshoot part of the application if something like that happens. Which is another kind of good place to look as well. How do you determine that an application is running, is healthy, is doing what it expects to be, what you expect it to be doing? Typically I've seen a lot of applications, they'll implement a health endpoint in an API. So they'll hit that, they'll ping it, they'll get a Pong response back, and okay, it must be good, right?
I just wait for the users to complain.
Yeah, you probably want to be a little bit more proactive than that. Yeah, so there's all kinds of health check middleware out there as well. There's actually a health check part to the app metrics library as well. You can write your own to query the database and make sure that it's actually able to connect to the database, and you can get a health check response from that as well. You can check various different third-party systems and verify that the complete environment is up and running. When I'm designing these types of things, I'm thinking in the back of my head that I would love every application I work on to become as successful as like a Netflix or something like that. With thousands of microservices and redundancy built in, and you can unleash Chaos Monkey in the middle of the day, and the application is still going to function because of all the redundancy and decoupling that's built into the system.
Yeah. It's ambitious.
It's a goal.
I think it's a good one.
Yeah. So with all the data collection, you also want to be able to determine what the data is telling you. Do you have false positives in there? Do you have runaway logging statements that are just pounding the database with useless information? So you want to make sure that you understand what it is you're logging, what it is that data is telling you. So when a user does say, hey, feature isn't working, you can go in and decide and determine that I got this message coming in, I got this request, I got this response, I got this method call, I got this function, I got this exception, and then kind of debug from there, right?
So have you ever looked at, I think it's called Raygun?
I haven't.
Raygun.io. It's for, I think it's Raygun.io or Raygun.com. It's actually for C#. They do crash reporting, real time user monitoring, a whole bunch of stuff. I believe one of their things is like automatically paying attention to your app and logging specific errors to your Azure ADO.net or ADO. Oi, they need to quit renaming it to Azure ADO in your backlog if something goes wrong. It's either Raygun or one other one that I can't think of right now, but
Yes,
that's
when
a-
an exception happens, then a bug report is actually added to your backlog, something like that.
yeah.
Yeah, I've seen similar in like Jira systems. Will have different third party applications can hook into your systems like that as well.
But anyway, thought I'd bring that one up since we talked about a few of the other things. That one's always been interesting. It is not free, unfortunately.
How about just getting sort of digging into this? What sort of resources? I know we've mentioned a lot of different ones. Where did you kind of go, John, to sort of when you were researching this topic?
Honestly, I went to docs.microsoft.com to begin with, and well, to be fair, I probably went to Google first and ended up on docs.microsoft.com and just looked at the basic examples to start with. Just the iLogger interface and the sample applications on there, and then kind of built up from there. I've heard a lot of good things and a lot of podcasts that I listen to speaking about Serialog and the functionality that adds to a logging solution. So I wanted the opportunity to implement that and had a need and decided that was the right time to do that. Wanted to be able to determine the metrics of the applications that I was working on. Are we handling requests properly? Are we going to be able to scale appropriately? And found the appmetrics.io suite of projects and started implementing some of those. Wanted to make sure that we were able to determine that an application was healthy, so started adding some health checks to the applications and those types of things. On the larger application for the throughput concern, where we were told that we needed to be able to handle $10 to $20 million or 10 to 20 million requests per day. I wanted to make sure that I understood what resources we needed and what types of calls and requests we were going to be expecting. So plugged in Application Insights and really was able to track down that I was newing up context in Entity Framework or EF Core when I didn't actually need to. So I wanted to slim that down. So now I'm able to make multiple calls in parallel. So I'm looking at making sure that that's as quick as possible so that we can process all the requests as they're made of the resources. So
Cool. Very cool.
Well, did you have anything else you wanted to discuss about logging and metrics, John?
I would say that that's probably a good start. We'll add a lot of resources in the show notes. So be sure to head on over to sixfiguredev.com and look for those resources that we've got on the website there. But absolutely reach out. Let us know what you think. And we'd love to hear from you guys, dear listeners. If you have any particular resources on logging or metrics, we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, certainly. Go ahead.
You can definitely hit us up on Twitter, but don't forget our Slack channel. It's a great place to reach out and tell us all about it. So,
All right. So if that's all, if you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
And be sure to follow us on Twitter at SixFigureDev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I am John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I am John Ash.